Greetings, listeners. This is Dave here. I'm interrupting this broadcast to make a couple announcements before we get to this episode of Season 2, Consensus Unreality. This will be the first episode featuring an interview with Aidan Wachter, and I have to say this is by far one of our best and one of my favorites. So I do hope you enjoy this. Briefly, before you hop in there, please check out patreon.com/consensusunreality for bonus episodes, written content, and much more. We've been getting up to some real weird stuff over there, and all of our great Patreon subscribers have been getting really involved. So check that out. Enjoy the interview. Take care.
Welcome to Season 2 of Consensus Unreality. We're back after a brief hiatus. We were both doing some other stuff. Life has been busy. This is the second attempt to record this. We had a little bit of craziness.
Riddled with technical difficulties,
yeah. So thanks for joining us again. We're back. We have Aidan Wachter here today, who's writer on occult and magical topics. We're going to talk about his new book, Weaving Fate, which we both really loved, and had scheduled an interview, and then, life happened.
Life happens.
Yeah.
Now
we're in Season 2.
Totally. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to get here.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks you so much for coming on. This is a great way to start off Season 2, as I think this book deals with some themes we've been kind of circling around for a while, and also kind of, pushes us in a different direction, away from some of the UFO kind of stuff we were looking at for a while, as that, has kind of devalued itself lately, magically, I think. But now we'll be back talking about that eventually. But thanks again for coming on, Aiden. And kind of wanted to start out just by asking what sort of your path to getting into this kind of thing was like, and what some early influences were, where you're at now, that kind of thing.
Totally. This is always such a hard question because I've talked about it a lot and written about it a lot, so I always try and see if I can find an angle. For me, I got into magic because my life had gotten really strange on one side, and B, because I didn't really buy the kind of consensus reality that I was growing up in out in the California suburbs. My parents didn't seem happy. Really, nobody I knew's parents seemed happy. So you had kind of all of this adult structure, and this was kind of the 70s divorce boom as well. So everybody that you knew, pretty much, his parents were exploding and families were exploding. Even though I was pretty young for it, it was kind of the 70s to me were this letdown off of the 60s energy, right? We had this shift, and then it just kind of all got dumb. And I wasn't super into it. So I kind of went hunting for weird stuff. And then as I kind of started looking to it, I began realizing, wait a second, I have experiences that are related to these things. So I had a lot of sleep paralysis as a kid. I had a really intense and terrifying dream state outside of that. I didn't see a lot of stuff when I was awake, but I saw enough stuff on occasion to really kind of throw stuff in, and my parents were just totally disinterested. Even though, weirdly, kind of as I got older, they were around some folks. I remember, I don't know if they both did. I think they both went to kind of a Rajneeshi-run psychic development class. I know my mom got a really solid, kind of clairvoyance, far-seeing, past-seeing thing. and it totally flipped her shit out, and she was like not interested at all.
Yeah.
And to me, that was like, come on, you finally did something cool. You know? But they were, again, not interested. And so I think I got into the stuff, for those reasons. I began looking at could I find anything that made sense? And I found some of the magical stuff kind of course, through science fiction and fantasy. Roger Zelazny in particular was a big influence on me, and how I practice and how I think about it. And then into things like Castaneda and some of the stuff that led to, some of the there was a fair amount of publishing at that time of kind of, I want to say, and I don't know the years of it, but things like Wallace Black Elk and stuff like that. So you're going, okay, these are not cultures I have any ties to, but what they're talking about as kind of how to try and be in the world makes way more sense than what I'm seeing out here in this kind of wasteland.
Yeah, I thought the introduction to Weaving Fate was really amazing, because it starts off with a tone of personalization for what I found to be a very personal book, a book about inciting personal change. And it seemed like you had a very wide array of influences as to arriving at writing this type of material. Was chaos magic an important sort of foundational tool?
Yeah, it was. I knew a magician and I knew a witch that I'd met. I guess the magician, who was a Thelemite, ended up being, high up in the OTO for a while. I think he's still involved. Though I haven't spoken to him in many years. When I was 15, and then the witch I worked at a bookstore with. And so as things were going on, she was really the one that was kind of helpful. He was kind of like, well, this is how you would go into ceremonial magic. But it didn't gel at that point, whereas she was kind of like, I'd ask her something like, I'd have some weird experience and I'd read enough somewhere to go like, maybe that was a Men in Black experience, and I'd ask her that, and she'd actually like call her mom, who also was heavily involved in kind of psychical and magical and paranormal stuff. And so they were the first people that were like treating it just as normal. Right.
Amazing.
They weren't actively, I didn't see any sign that they were actively trying to produce phenomenon. They were just experiencing it. And then a few years later, when I was 19, I met another Thelemite, but this guy was working in a bookstore, and at that point I was really interested in learning. It kind of had become clear like I'd had some crazy experiences that are in the book before I had met him, and talking to him, I was like, oh, maybe I could use this magic stuff in a more structured way to get a handle on what's been going on already. Because a lot of it was not pleasant at all. And among the stack of books he gave me was Liber Null and Psychonaut. And though I tried to read it a couple of years ago and found it really way less interesting, but it's 30 years on, what do you expect? But at that time, it gave me like a kind of filter to look at Rigardi, to look at Crowley, to look at Grant. Because I'd been exposed to Grant already by that point. I think I either had Outside the Circles of Time or The Magical Revival. It was just like, what the fuck? But it gave me a kind of, like I said, kind of a filter, so that when I was reading Crowley, I could go, okay, he says it's for this, but do I think that based on what the actions are, that is the result one would get if you are kind of force-feeding yourself that result, right? So that's kind of how I used chaos magic. And I think I mentioned it in the book, but so to me, the value of chaos magic was realizing that there were all of these different ways to do magic that have been done historically, some really old, some really new, some really uncool. Like we could throw in law of attraction even for that, right? Or Napoleon Hill's kind of stuff, which is generally highly poo-pooed, though folks like Mitch Horowitz are breaking down some of those barriers. And you could go, okay, so the issue isn't that there's a better way. There's just lots of ways. Different ways work better at different times and places for some people, and that there's a reason for that. And so that through kind of taking that as the lens that I used chaos magic, is you go, okay, well, what works for me? Not what do I think will work for me or should, or I've been convinced because this guy's got a good argument. What can I look at and go, okay, I'm going to try this practice for 6 months or a year, or I'm going to do this ritual 45 times in the next 2 months, and I'm going to see what happens. And really kind of, to use an overused around the chaos thing, kind of taking that Jeet Kune Do approach of like, let's experiment with it, see if it's useful to me, and if it isn't, let's set it aside. It doesn't mean I'll never come back to it, but it's just not functional right now. So that's how chaos magic was to me. But yeah, I was very active in the chaos magic world. There's still some of my stuff floating around that I wrote as Fire Clown towards the end of my time in the IoT and the beginning of founding the Z cluster. So yeah, chaos magic was very important to me. Though I definitely at this point don't consider myself a chaos magic, because it's kind of my general thing. A lot of these terms mean something really specific to a lot of people.
Right.
And they don't to me. So I just try not to use them because it's cleaner that way. I don't get people going, but
yeah.
It's all about free belief. It's like, whatever.
Yeah. That makes sense. Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. What, maybe this is a provocative question, I don't know, but where do you break from like sort of the popular idea of chaos magic? Where does that like hit a wall for you?
I hit the wall with that in about somewhere between 97 and 99. I'm not sure exactly when. Retrospectively, that was a very fuzzy time in my life because there was so much going on. But somewhere in there, I would say that the really silly side of chaos magic became very prevalent. And that just never actually worked for me. I played with it. Now, we'd had good results in heavy quotes, doing kind of stuff rooted in Lovecraftian stuff, kind of using the Pseudonomicon from Phil Hine as a guide. But like that was the only place that I kind of really played in that stuff much. And what hit me was this idea that, again, kind of looking at this, I had a shift at some point. I'm not sure when it happened, where I went, wait a second. I think we've been doing this since before we were technically modern humans. And so there's this really deep roots. And I think that they become interesting to me in my interpretation well before kind of the Grimoire period or any of that stuff. I'm really interested in kind of things that get lumped together into shamanism or indigenous sorcery practices and things like that. Those things make more sense to me. And so the shift for me was going, okay, I see that that's a place where you could play and have fun, and I'm all about playing and having fun with magic. But to me, there's this core reality that you hit, that you go, this is in the blood and it's in the bones of this body that I'm in. It's kind of permanently built into the neurology. And for me, working closer to that line simply works better.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So I'm all about,
sense.
it's where I'm really with the chaos thing, is being super experiential. Is like going like, no. If you haven't had it work for you, there's no reason to think it will work the way that person told you will. If you have reason to believe that they know what they're talking about, you can probably believe that it'll work. But their result and your result are likely to be extremely different.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting parts of Liber Null to me, is the chapter on shamanism, and you could see that direct lineage straight up to like Kenneth Grant, 1999.
Yeah, and so like one of the books that's not very popular, as far as I know, in chaos magic, though it is in print again, was Nicholas Hall, who was part of that old, British IoT scene, and he's got a book called Chaos and Sorcery that is really specifically working with sorcery as defined in Liber Null. So, working with material bases. And so that was the chapter that got me. It was like the idea of like, okay, no, I can see that if I look at what I've done, as soon as material bases become involved, and particularly more organic material bases, meaning not less manufactured. So like plastic doesn't really do shit for me magically. It never has. As soon as I kind of got into that, I went, okay, everything that I do that has a serious material base, and we're even talking things on paper, petitions, sigils, things like that, that stuff has a very different level of effect on the kind of walking around reality than kind of any of the mental processes that I can do around it, you know. And not being a great visualizer may have a part of that, that I can't really create those kind of internally generated structures that a lot of people can do and can kind of anchor thought form stuff too. For me, it's, you know, I'm going to go and find stones or wood or whatever and carve that shit into some fashion and feed it some fluids and see if I can get it to wake up. And for me, that's what always works. And so that was, you know, I think that was the biggest, that might have retrospectively been the biggest takeaway from Libernal and Psychonaut for me. It was that specific thought, because it did cause me to go, okay, no, this does way different things and way more effective things as soon as we bring the material bases into it.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, I've always had the most success with just like sigils on paper and adding, you know, some, you know, elemental aspect to it. Way more than any kind of more mind sort of bound stuff. So that's a great point. So speaking of like sigils, I guess maybe like what's a good definition of a hyper sigil, since that's sort of the basis of the book here.
So I kind of run off of, I don't know whether I got this directly from Grant Morrison, who's kind of where the term came from. I had been doing hypersigil work, but not having a name for it, which is weird. So I don't know whether he started talking about that after I stopped reading the Invisibles. I read some of the early Invisible stuff, and then life got in the way, and I never got back to it until a couple of years ago. But a friend of mine, Fabeku Fatumishe, he taught a class on hypersigils that I took. And as soon as he started talking about it, I was like, wait a second, I totally do this. I had a different approach than he does, but this is something that I do. And that kind of dug me into going, oh, there's other people that are actually been writing about this shit. I don't read a lot of occult stuff, so I definitely did up until 99, 2000, somewhere in there. And then I just kind of went, okay, I'm more interested in what I actually am doing than hearing what other people think about what they're doing, for the most part. And so hypersigil is basically a long-form narrative piece of magic done in any way. So there are people who do paintings, that do poetry, that do novels, that, you know, do comic books like Morrison did. And my approach I experimented some, but my approach has always been journals. And that's what, you know, Weaving Fate focuses on, is the Black Book, which is this false journal. But anyway, so the idea is that instead of having it be like either a single shot spell like you might do in witchcraft, or a ritual for a particular focused thing where you're trying to get a car and you do one ritual and see if that works, or like a practice where you're taking on a long-term practice to see how that works or how you can learn to use it, which is more like what we think of as zone rites or banishing ritual type structures, or casting circles and doing that kinds of things. The hypersigil instead is like something where you're kind of on a very regular basis adding to the narrative storyline, with the end goal that storyline begins to manifest in some fashion in your life.
Right. That's great. Right now I'm working on a poem, like sort of doing that. So it's kind of, you know, not following exactly what's happening in the book, but sort of my own take on that. Do you think, I mean, I read The Invisibles for, you know, a little while ago now, and I don't know if Grant Morrison's spoken on it, but to what extent was that like an intentional is intention a necessary part of a hypersigil, or is there like a way that it can sort of be its own thing?
This is kind of interesting because this ties into something that I've been writing about for the book that'll come out next. And I think that there's two answers to that. And one is, the intention is necessary, but there's a caveat. I think now that one of the things that I think now is that a lot of what we do magically, as far as practices and magical actions, this is, and by that I'm differentiating between study. So reading about it is different than magic. That stuff influences a worldview. Worldview is important and it'll influence your actions, but it's the stuff you actually do that are magic. So intentional practices, intentional magical practices, part of what I think happens because I'm an animist and because I believe that there's way more spirit involvement than anybody except us animist, spirit-driven kind of freaks think, and probably more than that. I think what's happening is that we're raising our visibility, right? And we could think of this as being the New Age way of talking about this is that we're raising our frequency as if there's some specific frequency we're trying to get to, and I don't really buy that. But what I think of is it's like turning up your brightness, right? And so if we think of that and we think of insects out in the country, right? If you've ever been out in, I don't know where you guys are from, but if you've ever been out in deep forest somewhere wet in, the spring, you're kind of okay until you turn on a light, right?
Yeah.
And then everything comes for you, and some of them want to suck your blood.
Right.
And to me, this is kind of what the practice of magic is in a lot of ways, is we're trying to kind of consolidate and cohere and focus and brighten our light. This is just language. Don't think that I'm talking light, and again, I'm not specific here. This is just an analogy.
Yeah.
So we're trying to basically increase our visibility or increase our noticeability. And intention is really important with that. And so that's how I think that matters in the hypersigil. So yeah, occasionally you might have somebody who's already pretty bright in that way. And so when they are doing things, they're talking out loud, they're writing. These are the people we think of as being natural manifestors. Mm-hmm. These are the people who actually get really good results with things like law of attraction. It's not that's because it's kind of a weak technology. It's not great tech. But there is an aspect of it that's correct if you're already in the right place. So somebody who's been practicing magic for 20 years who goes to play with that shit tends to have really good results with it. And so it's an interesting thing. So for some people, no, you don't have to do as much work to kind of get it to start manifesting. And that's where the kind of heavy intentionality, that's where the consecration work goes. That's where the regular feeding and stuff goes. Because in my worldview, which is, again, I'm not trying to sell my worldview to anybody. I don't care what anybody believes. This is just based on my experience. I think that if you have kind of consolidated that light, which is, again, we're just using analogies, shit notices you and begins the things that are interested in playing with you go, oh yeah, we could do that. Or they go, okay, I would like to do that, but I'm not really interested in the one night stand. And so what's the arrangement? Which is not necessarily transactional. It's more reciprocal kind of symbiosis, right? And so that's where that intention piece becomes really critical, because otherwise you get really random shit.
Yep.
Right.
You get the things that you have something around that goes, oh yeah, I could get you a new car. All we have to do is crash this one. Which is are more common stories, and I think people like to discount them, but they do happen more to magicians than to other people, I think.
Yeah, that's really funny. Wow.
Yeah,
it's interesting too. I'm not even sure what the question is here, but the relationship between something like a hypersigil, where it's pretty focused, and we're speaking about the intentionality setting and stuff, and then sort of cultural egregores and thought forms, and kind of the analogy of turning up the brightness. It just makes me think like what's happening when an egregore is formed into the world and manifests, with that unintentional energy behind it, but snowballing,
Well, and I think it's a really interesting thing, and I think that's true everything from kind of political stories, cultural stories that are political in nature. If we think about the stories that the U.S. tells about itself, right? Yeah. We are the good guys. Everybody looks us on through kind of stuff that came out in the Middle East wars, right? They hate us for our freedom. It's like, a lot of people really take that on as absolute truth, right? And it has its own kind of power. And so there is intentionality behind it, I think, now.
Right.
And I think we can see that throughout empires. Like if we were to throw folks that have a very sophisticated understanding of psychology and advertising, and we got to walk around Rome or something, I imagine we would see very intentional use of that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I think it's very related. And one of the big things for me is it also brought me into magic through the Temple of Psychic Youth, is this idea of decontrol and deconditioning from that cultural formatting, which is, again, consensus on reality is clearly speaking in some fashion to that. That you go, yeah, this is as it is because we agree it is on some way. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily that what we're seeing isn't happening, but would it be happening if we agreed on a different baseline? Mm-hmm. And I think that magic in general, my interest in it is highly tied to that. And I think that, yeah, when we're looking at egregores, like if you look at any extreme conspiracy theory, is heavily, heavily wedded to that idea. Like we begin to change our mind to the degree that we begin to see what we expect to see everywhere we look for it.
Right.
Which is an interesting thing. Ralph Abraham, who is way beyond me, but is a chaos mathematician. I don't know if he's alive now, but he with an interest in John Dee, among other things. I met him through some Enochian magicians that I knew. And he said, we were talking, and I asked him some question that apparently was the right question to ask him. I have no idea what it was. This was, again, in my early 20s. And in response to whatever this question was, Ralph said that what he found really interesting about chaos math and chaos science was that he didn't think there was a bottom. He didn't think that, he thought anytime you could create the theoretical possibility for something to exist, you could find it. And if you could create a tool that could see deeper, you would find something deeper, because there's no bottom, which I think is really tied into a lot of thoughts that come out of Hermeticism and other stuff, where they're really discussing a lot of the times that, and as this is directly tied into a lot of quantum stuff, I know that the gaze influences the object that it's looking upon, right? And so, again, we're tied into all that stuff. All of these kind of shaping influences, egregores, all that stuff, shape what you expect to see, what you look for, what you notice, which then changes reality.
Yeah, that relationship is so interesting, how magic and Hermeticism is reified by quantum physics. I know Eric Wargo, one of our previous guests, would probably be correcting me right now because he's spoken a little bit about how the New Age kind of takes concepts of quantum physics and just runs with them or whatever. But I think there is some strong reification there for sure.
Well, and I just think it's kind of like if we were to look at that law of attraction, ceremonial magic, shamanism, we could say there's relations between these things, that in some way they are related. I think where we get really fucked up is when we try and say this is happening because of this effect, because I think it's far more complex than that. That's always been my take. I don't know if I'm right.
Yeah. The bottom's about to fall out on that question.
Yeah. So something I got to thinking about when you mentioned that you were kind of like already doing hypersigils when you found out about it. Do you think people have sort of always been doing that? Because you also mentioned that like magic is sort of like it's part of like our bodies almost. Do you think that people have like historical things like is like Dante's Divine Comedy a hypersigil? Like how far back can you go, and like at what point? Well,
the question is, I think so. The hypersigil is interesting because it's a specifically intentional piece of work, right, done by an individual. But I think we can see that, and it's one of the things that I think human culture is tied into the same thing. If we look at the ideas of ancestral memory, if we look at, and by that I mean stuff that's intentionally passed down, so oral tradition, if we go back far enough, right? These are stories about how the world is that reinforce how the world is for the people who are experiencing that. And I don't really see that as necessarily different, right? So if I was raised in a culture that believed that or that had a full-on experience that the dead are constantly coming back, that you meet them in the woods, you meet them around the fire, you meet them when you're sleeping, that there are spirits everywhere, that you are interacting with them, that this is being pointed out to you as a tiny little person. You're going to live in a world that is pretty much like that. And I'm not sure that that's totally different than the hypersigil concept.
Right.
Which is why I think it's so important to really look at our kind of baseline beliefs and determine whether they actually work for us. Because usually that stuff is, most of us are running on some kind of a default, unless we've had either a magical reason to do it or some kind of really in-depth meditation practice that really has caused us to look at all that stuff and eventually go, oh, I think this is true, but I actually don't find any evidence for it. So do I continue thinking it's true? Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, I guess we should switch gears back to getting into the bulk of this book, and I know I've heard you spoke a little bit before about kind of the reason why you personally may have switched gears for Weaving Fate. And this was sort of written during the pandemic, right?
It was finished during the pandemic.
Yeah.
It was about 80% written before it. Yeah, for me, what happened was I had written a bunch of it, and then switched gears and decided I would try teaching a class online called Building the Bones that I did for about 100 people. And as that class was ending, the pandemic was really moving into people's consciousness. And I already knew a lot of people who were having really hard times due to like losing jobs, losing job opportunities, folks who were immunosuppressed or immunocompromised, who were like on it really early, like, okay, I can't afford to go do this anymore. And so I knew that the book as it was already kind of the most useful tool set I could think of in that situation. And so we just decided to switch gears back to the book and away from the classes to try and get it out and get it into people's hands at a point where I thought people would have the time to read it and apply it probably at a greater rate than usual. And then to some degree, some of the end of the book and some of the end of the course kind of merged and changed each other a little bit to touch kind of specifically on this time. Not as being pandemic specific, but as being things that are kind of good to keep in mind when things are going to shit, which they often are. So
I like, calling it self-help is like a scary term for like a book or something, but I think this book is like, I've bought it as a gift for people already because I think it's like a great window into the world of magic, because it's a positive way for inciting change in your life, creating processes to incite positive change. Whether you have a history of knowing about the occult or magic or not, I think it's really, really important and useful in that way. And I found that to be pretty uplifting context of the book.
That's awesome to hear. I mean, that was definitely the intent, is you try and, at least for me, it's like I have a bunch of theory in my head or ideas about magic in my head that will probably come out in later books, but right now it's kind of like trying to get actionable material out in a context or in a form that's highly usable. And so there was stuff that could have gone into that book that didn't make sense to me because it would have kind of broken the usability side. I really wanted it to be something where you could really not know much and go and do that thing if you were willing.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And I think within that too, like the incantations you wrote in there are very poetic, and I think the sigils are very beautiful too. Like, even if somebody didn't really have a groundwork of sigilling and stuff, like just that as a book and not an occult text, I think it's very beautiful in that way too. And yeah, for sure. And I found the practice of the fever stone was one of my favorite parts of the book, very moving and inspiring. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on this process a little bit and its significance.
Yeah, so, it's funny. That's the part of the book that I always can I've talked about this a bunch, but that's for anybody that does go play with the book. If you are using the corridor and the black book and not getting the results you want, do the Fever Stone, and that usually fixes that. So the Fever Stone came about from trance work. There's a group of entities that I work with in the other world, which is just the term that I use for not a waking reality. When I'm there, it's nothing like here. It's a different universe, different world in some way, that I can walk around in half the year. Generally, I can do it in the cold seasons. I can't do it at all in the hot seasons. And there's a group of spirits there that I call the Sisters, and the Sisters have been kind of my main otherworld connection for a long time. As far as they're usually who I interact with if I interact with somebody that I know that I've seen before. And I brought a question to them about how to try and fix some of my shit. And they took me to another chunk of the other world, and handed me over to this tribe of what I perceive. And again, I'm trying to be as clear as possible about all this stuff all the time, so you'll get all these caveats out of me. I perceive these guys as a band of hunter-gatherer, probably Neanderthal. The part that I've dealt with is all men, hence I call them the brothers. They don't call themselves that. But they're this hunter group that is kind of like the most extreme proto-shamanic group that I could have fallen in with, I think. I don't know their language, but they can kind of speak into my head. They don't actually make a lot of vocalizations that I've seen. The Sisters do. They actually talk, but the brothers don't usually. And yeah, they basically said, yeah, we can do this for you, but we need you to do preparatory work. And then we're going to do stuff to you that we can't tell you what it is before we do it. So you have to just decide if you're down blind. So that seemed totally legit to me in this circumstance. And so they did a bunch of shit to me, and they gave me practices to do. And the primary practices that they gave me is the Fever Stone practice in the book. So I am not the author of that except in the form that it's in the book. The practice comes from the brothers. So with that out of the way, it's basically a way of kind of, first, there's two aspects. And the first is the washing the stone. And the washing the stone is a great one for people to try as a first into that book if they don't have much experience with magic, because it doesn't require the consecration or any of that stuff first. You could just begin doing that piece. And it's basically just deciding that some rock that you find, and it's really important that it not be special. You just go find a rock. And you begin washing it every day in salt water. And you treat it as a living object that is the manifestation of the trauma and damage and hurt that has happened to you through your entire ancestral line, which, again, thinking long view, is millions of years. And you wash it every day, and you say a little charm over it, and tell it what you're doing, and you do that every day for at least a month. And for what a lot of people find happen is that at some point that clicks on. Sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it's later. Some people don't notice a lot from it, but they notice other things shift in their life. Of course, some people are not going to get anything from it. This is all, there's no practice that's going to work for everybody. The second piece of that deals with the idea the brothers talked about, that trauma, pain, kind of hurt, whether it be physical, psychological, emotional, however you want to view it, sometimes is clean. It's just a clean cut. You wash it out, you bind it up, it heals up, you're fine. Maybe there's some limited range of motion for a little while, right? That kind of thing, the usual injury shit that doesn't really matter. And generally what happens is we come back a little stronger from most of those kinds of things, right? Bones knit back stronger. Scar tissue is stronger than your skin, that kind of thing. But there's another kind, and that's where something actually gets stuck inside the wound and festers. And what their theory is, if we're going to state that they have a theory, this is their experience, is that kind of we're thinking now metaphorically in the astral world and otherworldly. So don't think that we're talking necessarily about physical events here, but the trauma occurs, and for whatever reason, we don't let it go. And calcification begins to occur. And this is a little bit, how I think about it is a little bit kind of like how pearls form in oysters, right? We begin to try and protect ourselves from that trauma by building up this shell. And that shell is what they call the fever stone. And what they're saying, what they've taught me, is that the fever stone there's a couple of issues with it. And one is that this trauma cannot be processed because it's encapsulated and it's so deeply held. And so you first have to kind of get it out of I guess what we could call kind of the etheric body or the spirit body. And the second part is that whole process of the trauma and the encapsulation is basically like power that has been siphoned off of us, magical power, that is locked up in that structure. So this two-part thing is happening. We want to get it out of kind of the spirit body so that it's no longer doing damage. And then we want to kind of transmute it through in an alchemical sense to free up all that power so that we actually can use it. A lot of people that I've talked to that are kind of get confused on there, thinking that the power is or that the burning thing is really just that's kind of the release of the trauma, and it's really not. It's the release of the power locked up by the trauma in the stone. And yeah, for me, that's been a hugely beneficial process. That's one of the things I can say magically I've had no downsides from. And it's weird because sometimes you'll do things that are like seem like really minor, and you'll be like, get up from doing the work or get up the next morning. And you're like, okay, my entire world feels totally different. And you'll do really heinous, you'll go after really heinous things that have happened to you, and you don't get that same thing. And so it's very weird. It's not like the biggest trauma produces the most kind of energy suck or something, which I find really strange. I've not talked to the brothers about that. I'll probably talk to them about that this winter because this is something that has come up with a lot of folks that have been doing the practice, and I'm kind of interested in their take on it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you for recounting that for our listeners. That was awesome.
Yeah. That's I haven't done that one yet, but I'm hoping to. That's sort of like my I have some things I'd like to kind of maybe apply that to. Yeah,
it's definitely funky. I mean, it's the thing that's the most similar to it effect wise that I found is the feeding your demons practice that's taught by Sultram Aliani, which is a Buddhist practice based on Chod based stuff from Madhya Labran. And the fever stone to me is more, they're directed in different ways, but the feeling of them is very similar. And sometimes I find that in 6 ways I recommended the feeding your demons practice. And again, there's people that have, I think I've seen more success for magical folks with the fever stone than I have with feeding your demons practice, though. Folks that have got a deeper meditation background seem to do pretty damn well with the feeding your demons thing.
Yeah. Huh. That's awesome. What about this other sort of aspect of telling true lies? What is what's the deal with that, I guess, is the question.
So this is a concept that came out for me in the 90s. And I was living in New Orleans, working with the folks that taught me jewelry and doing the work that we were doing with the Z cluster. And we had a really active group of about, probably variable, but maybe up to 20 people sometimes that were doing ritual work. And I was kind of super dissatisfied with the term magic because it was so ceremonially locked in at that time, kind of like at that time witchcraft pretty much meant Wicca in the US. Similar thing there. And I was going to the Tulane Library and doing a lot of research in that library, because the big university libraries, if they'll let you in, are usually great places to find lots of kind of etymology, anthropology, things like that you can play with. Now more of that stuff is generally available due to the internet, but back then that was not the case. And so I began playing, I think in the Oxford English Dictionary, in the full version, they had a Proto-Indo-European root section, and then I found some big sections on etymology and began looking at that, and then just academic studies on magic to see where they kind of talked about where the words came from. And I ended up with this, I have the sloppiest handwriting on earth and am not an organized on paper guy. I kind of have to use the computer, which I didn't have then, to be organized. So I just had these, probably like a 5-subject notebook piled with notes. And from all this study and from those pile of notes, I came up with this description of sorcery as being one who lays out lots, which is a dictionary definition, I believe, or at least it was at that time. And what I interpreted that to be was that if we think about a lot as being both like a rune, it would be the common use for that, some kind of we could think of tarot cards, but I think they were really speaking specifically to kind of pieces of wood or bones with things written on them that you could interpret somebody's fate with. And that this is where that term, someone's lot from life, comes from, right? So sorcery on one hand then is one who lays out lots, but it didn't say that it was one who drew lots. And I took this as kind of an idea. I said, okay, so does this mean that this is different than divination? And kind of sitting with it in my head, I went, yeah, if we're looking at sorcery is different than divination. So instead of going, I'm going to go pull 3 runes or pull 3 tarot cards, and this is what it's telling me is going down, I'm going to consciously choose those things and lay them down and say, this is what's going down. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then through roots of the words, I believe it was coming out of Warlock. It's in the book. I can't remember for sure. I don't have the best memory for all this stuff super specifically. But the term there was, there's all this stuff that is really linked into lying. And that didn't really make sense as to why this was interlaced with power until we really look at the idea of truth and lies as being in some way not meaning the same thing as we think of it now, where we're thinking dishonesty, right? And what this came up for me was, I think this was the warlock word, I'm pretty sure. The definition I came up with was that the warlock was one who tells the true lies. So these two things merged for me. So I went, okay. So the laying out of lots is kind of telling true lies, right? You're going, if I can make this actually manifest through this process, then yes, I was lying when I said this is what's coming. But after it comes, I wasn't lying. It's not true.
Right.
This to me is magic, right? We do all of this ritual action stating something is true that isn't currently true.
Right. Yeah.
And in a sense, the kind of hypersigil process, as I teach it in the book, is explicitly about this. It's really about how do I learn to tell the lies, the non-truth, things that are currently not true, in a way that they become true later, in a really specific way. So one of the things that for me happened playing with this kind of stuff is it changed all of my language around magic. If I'm talking to the allies, I tell them what I want. If I'm talking to the field, I'm telling them what I have. Even though that's not what I have now. Right? Does that make sense as a distinction?
Yeah.
Because the allies know what I'm not involved beyond my part of my relationship with them in how the stuff manifests. If I hand it to them, they're the ones doing it.
Yeah.
If I'm doing it, though, I'm after what I want to be really clear about the end result. And I'm not asking. I'm saying this is the experience that I'm having. Which is, again, this is why some of the people freak out about this book, that they're like, this is some super sick self-delusional approach to The Secret. And I'm like, That's not entirely wrong, but it's not entirely right. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could. There's that in that process of writing yourself, mailing yourself the letters too, which you wrote about. Yeah, and I thought that was super interesting tool. You know, how did you come upon that idea?
Again, more stuff from the book. I knew this guy who was a magician who was as weird as I was, meaning that he had some strange practices that he'd come up with on his own. And I didn't know a lot of people who really did this then. The chaos magicians that I knew, a lot of them were kind of, again, getting sillier and sillier. So it was kind of traditional ritual structures, but with, you know, my go-tos. I knew a friend who apparently had a very healthy working relationship with Ultraman. Whatever, it worked for him, it did not work for me.
Yeah.
So this guy came up with some interesting shit. And one of the things that he had was he had a heavily sigilized old manual typewriter, really old, like from the 40s. It was like the thing that you'd see William Burroughs with in pictures of him, the old Royal typewriter or something. But the thing was encrusted with sigils and had candle wax all over it. And was like in its own little shrine in his room. And I was over at his place one time, and it's maybe the third time I was in there. I like knew him enough at that point. I was like, dude, you got to tell me about the typewriter. He said, oh, you can use the typewriter. And I said, what do you do? He goes, you write what you want to happen on the typewriter, and it'll make it come true. And I thought this was the most awesome thing. It's like, this is a brilliant piece of magical thinking here.
Yeah.
So I did this a few times on his typewriter, and I got some results, but I didn't get great results from it. And but I was kind of enamored with the idea. And so the thing that I did was I began writing letters to myself and mailing them to myself as if I was somewhere else. This was especially good because at the time I was working in one city and I lived in another one. So I'd mail them from the city I worked in. So they would come postmarked from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I was telling myself about the cool shit that was going on in my life. And that worked really fucking well.
Yeah.
It was kind of weird, the degree to which that worked incredibly fucking well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. That's a hilarious anecdote too. It's like, you want to use my time machine over there? You know.
Totally. Go for it. Walk on in. See how it goes. Which was also, I mean, and this was one of the things that I got from a lot of group working too, as well as playing with other people, is that it was really that realization that methods that work for people vary a lot. And so there are things that are pretty universally effective. We could look at things like there are approaches to candle magic that work for most people, but that doesn't mean that's going to be the most effective thing for everyone.
Right.
And so that's where, again, that kind of experiential approach that I definitely picked up from Chaos Magic, and probably more than that from Jen Freeze, really feeds into that to me. Is it's like, take these things, figure out how they work, and then kind of play with your intuition and your own stuff and to your allies and go, how do I make this thing really work?
Yeah.
You know, and that's the biggest key to me for successful magic for anybody. Is like, I understand the view of the kind of grimoire specialists that are, you do it the way it is. That's its own power. And I think that it's a very valid path. But if that's not something that you're naturally drawn to, just get really hardcore about experimentation, and don't throw your babies out with the bathwater, but be comfortable changing the bathwater a bit and see what that does.
Yeah.
I love that concept of like collaging, you know, magical collage, and sort of tweaking it with what works for you, you know, and having this sort of modulation between different practices and stuff. Yeah, it's really amazing.
Right. Well, and it's also thinking that, you know, a lot of this stuff is that if we think about kind of archetypal effects on us as people, right, that there's archetypes, and this is a kind of, I guess, Jungian concept that has roots further back, but there's this way that it kind of gets laid out that there's a set number of archetypes in the world, right? That there's the warrior, there's the lover, there's the king, there's the magician, whatever, right? But if we look at kind of mass media now, and we look at all of that stuff, you could say that there's now dozens and dozens more of these things a lot of which are probably more specific to us now. So, one of the things that I posted the other day was like, on Instagram was just 4 images, and it was like Furiosa from Mad Max Fury Road and Riddick, and I can't remember who else, but and it's one of those things, is it's like realizing that right now it's worth looking at the archetype that you're living from a magical perspective, and this ties in very well with the Weaving Fate material as well, and going, is this actually useful to me?
Yeah.
It's not, is it a good one, a bad one? Is it the most powerful one? Like, arguably the sun is the most powerful planet, but that doesn't mean it's the best planet to use right now, planetary magic wise, depending on what you're after, right?
Right, yeah.
And so it is really interesting that we can kind of use all these processes to go, okay, where are my weak points? And can I come up with some balancing tools to bring those to at least get them out of the way so that they're not causing me trouble.
Right.
And especially right now, I think where we're kind of balanced in between, like, it's kind of like like at one point it was like, if we look at like Michael Moorcock multiverse stuff where you've got the war between order and chaos. Yeah. It's like the current one seems to be between like empathy and nihilism, right?
Yeah.
And how do we find our balance within there and go, okay, I don't want to be 100% on either end, because neither of them look fun. But there's all of this range in between there that you go, okay, I need to be comfortable with my emotional content so I'm not ruled by it. But I don't want to throw it out as it having no meaning, because that's also wrong. But I also need to be tough enough to manage a very kind of fucked up moment in history. And we can use all this kind of technique to get there, I think.
Yeah, that's very relevant, I feel like, to right now, for sure.
Yeah.
I think what I'm going to do right here we're about at 54 minutes. If we could get into maybe some of the goofier stuff on the back end here, maybe we could ask you about if you care to elaborate on this fairy ring incident on Mount Shasta.
Yes, I can talk about that.
It's kind of like it's thrown into the book a little bit. And,
I know.
Yeah, we were both like, we should ask him about that, because we did a pretty deep dive into like fairy kind of stuff, a few months ago. Yeah. So what was that experience?
So I have had the majority of my waking, eye-open, really weird experiences have happened on Mount Shasta or on the mountains around it. And this particular one that you guys are asking about was I was camped with my girlfriend at the time. I was probably 18 or 19 at the base of Castle Crags, which are these stones that stick out of the side of this mountain. And below it is this castle lake. And we were camped there. It was early in the summer, so we had the campground to ourselves because there was only one slot that you could pull into. All the rest of them had been in the shade, so there was still snow on the ground. So we had this awesome location with no one. People would like pull in and be like, there's no way to, nobody's got snow shovels with them, right? It's that horrible freeze and refreeze snow. So it's like, yeah, we got this place for a couple weeks, and as long as we don't move the car. And the witch that I mentioned lived there with her mother, who was also super intense. And yeah, such a funny day. So at this point I was doing magic, but in a kind of I would say what I was doing is really actually similar to what I talk about as being dirt sorcery in 6 ways, that I was kind of using found objects. I was kind of like trying to put power into them. I was figuring out what worked that way. I figured out that I could make like some protection amulets and things like that, but I didn't have any kind of actual skill. This was the point that the raw talent got me to, and that was the extent of it. And nothing really changed from there until things got much weirder as I started kind of working at it. So this day I decided I'm going to get up to the top of this Castle Crags place and I'm going to have lunch up there. So I packed my food, and retrospectively I realized I packed some offerings in there. I had some frankincense and some copal and some sage and a few other little things. I think I had a few pieces of wood that I'd carved into little charms. And I headed up around the lake and then back up this wall, which was really steep. And it was really covered with just the nastiest sagebrush in the world. There were like no paths through it.
Yeah.
I was really glad I was in boots and long pants because it had been pretty cold down below. But it was just kind of like, are you willing to get lacerated by this sagebrush long enough to kind of climb over it to get to the top? And for whatever reason, I was super into it. And I just kind of like started climbing my way up. And I could hear these crows, sometimes lots of them around me. It was really hot out in the sun on this kind of mountain side of the hill, mountain thing. And I got up to like one of the first places where there was exposed rock. And I stopped there, and I think I had lunch. And my best guess is that I probably made some kind of an offering there, because that's kind of, I didn't know what I was doing back then, but I was still doing some of that. And said like, look, if you really don't want me to get to the top, that's too bad, because I'm gonna go. So it would be cool if this was a little bit easier. And I remember saying that out loud there and eating, and I still smoked back then, so I'm sure having a cigarette. Finished lunch, got up, started climbing up the sagebrush again. And this went on for a while longer. I don't remember how long, but a good bit. And then I hit like a deer path. Like, okay, this is good. And at that point, I went into this place that I've experienced many times, where I am like fully invested and super gung-ho and ultra focused. So like now I'm going to the top of this thing, and I'm not thinking at all anymore. It's like it's just like drive to go. And I can totally remember that. So I start hauling ass along this deer trail. I'm stoked. I can hear the crows everywhere. And I finally make it up to where I kind of crest the top of that ridge. I've gone pretty far away from the crags I was looking at, so I'm now downhill from them a bit. But I crest the ridge, and because it's on the north side of the mountain there, it's a solid snowfield forever. So it's just, pine trees, fir trees, and snow, and nothing. Except there is this fucking, like, fairy cabin, like, preposterous, like, Germanic fairy cabin with the weird, like, upswept roof, that's kind of, I guess that's that convex thing. It's basically kind of like the witch's cabin in the woods. There's a big plume of smoke coming out of it. It's way off, but I can see it like it's really close, which is like the weirdest thing. Like I can see all the detail. I can see that the door is open, but it's way down there. It's way down this slope, and I start running. I'm like, down the slope, I'm going to the fairy cabin. I am totally in. And this totally clear voice in my head says, if you go, you can't come back. And I stopped dead in my tracks. And it was really interesting, because it was probably that might be the first time that I, again, retrospectively can think of having like a clear interaction with my allies, because it was my allies that said that. And I was like, oh. And I thought about it, and I had a strong compulsion to do it, but simultaneously I knew it was not a good idea.
Mm.
And so I was like, okay, well, that's really weird.
Yeah.
And went back out and went up to the crags and then worked my way back down.
Right.
And then the funny part of that is retrospectively. So I come back, things are weird. Either that night or the next day, I had this crazy, my first kind of, again, really strong waking possession experience. And my friend, the witch's mom, pulls up. And this woman is a really interesting woman. She had deep ties to Egyptian magic. She was Apache, and had lived up there for a long time. And she grabbed me. I don't think she ever really liked my girlfriend, so she didn't like any of my girlfriends, actually, retrospectively. I think that. She's like, why don't you walk with me? We'll have a cigarette. And so we're walking through the woods, and she's pointing out a couple of plants and kind of their medicinal uses. And we walk around the corner, and it's where she's walked us to is where you can see the crags. She goes, it is very strange up there. And I've not told her anything.
Wow.
And I said, yeah, I would agree with that. And she said, you've been up there. And I said, yeah, I went up there yesterday. And she said, well, that's very interesting, because usually the crows won't let people up there. And I was like, huh. And she's like, so you had an experience with the crows. I said, I heard the crows, but I never actually saw a crow. And she's like, that was interesting. And she basically said, well, because you're like you are, which totally flummoxed me, because I totally read this like, I thought what she was saying is like, because I had some like native connection or something, and that was a legit thing. And she was just like, no. That's not what I'm talking about. She's like, because of how you're wired, that's why the crows let you up there and you had the experience that you had. But anyway, so that was that story. Yeah, it was super. That was like the first one of like, that was probably the root of what got me going. I need to learn what's going on.
Yeah,
that's amazing. It's funny because in the book too, it's just mentioned, on page 3, and it's just putting it right out there. I love that.
That was funny because I have a friend that I work with on my books, Dre, and she has been kind of the primary reader of them when they're in pretty. And I have a few people that read them and give me suggestions, but she's been the one that's most consistently said, like, this is what would really help the book from the reader side. And there was a little bit of that stuff in there, and she's like, it would really help because we've spent enough time together for you to go a little bit in depth into some of the experiences that kind of are formative. And I didn't really get why. It felt right, so I did it. But retrospectively, even more so than in 6 Ways, I've had a ton of people reach out and go, this part of the book was immensely beneficial to me because I've had so much weird shit happen in my life. And you bring it up even around the magical folks, and if it doesn't fit their worldview, they're just like, yeah, whatever. So I think that's why that stuff is in there, was just so that people could have the experience of going like, oh, maybe that thing that happened
right.
was more real than anybody wanted me to give it credit for, and I keep throwing it away, but maybe that's not that.
For sure. Yeah, that's a great story too. The association of the inner voice, or the voice of the allies with like the fairy experience is, I feel like that's something I'm hearing more and more with like recent encounters of things in the realm of the fae and stuff.
I think that's true. I think that, because I've heard it from a few people too, that there's a lot of people that have, really set in stone ideas of what the fairy world is and what the fae are, and I'm not one of them, but there's definitely a reality there that is not the same as what a lot of people would interpret kind of otherworld reality, one of the things that strikes me as being very similar is kind of the description of the jinn as being like an alternate set of people who are actually here versus then spirits, you know?
Right.
And so the interactions in those worlds don't abide by the same rules that magicians might think that they do. And so I do think that that's, at least for me, I think that that's why the allies show up in situations like that for me, is they'll tell me when I'm kind of going somewhere outside of my purview. They don't tell me to stop, usually. But they have told me, like, you need to think about that for just a second, because we understand the compulsion, but it's not necessarily the best option for you.
Yeah.
You know?
That's funny. Yeah.
Which is, again, what you want your allies to do. You don't want your allies to just go along with whatever the fuck crazy idea you come up with.
You could do that, but are you sure you want to do that?
Yeah, you know, that's it. And that's, again, this is one of the things that people always tell people. How do you know they're your allies? Is because they'll tell you when you should not do something that you really want to do. You know.
Do some people have like wild allies who are like, just go in, man?
Oh man, that's a real thing too. I mean, it's like one of the things that I tell people a lot is like a lot of people get kind of a compulsive attraction to deities or spirits that are super chaotic, not in a bad way, but they're down for whatever. But the person that's actually having to live through the experiences is not necessarily down for whatever.
Right.
You have to be able to set boundaries or go, you know, this was fun, but we're breaking this off, and I need to find somebody a little mellower. That's a totally reasonable thing for someone to do. That was really my experience, I think, of a lot of the kind of pseudonomicon influenced elder god stuff. Is like, no, this is super attractive because of the weird, but my wife is weird enough already. I don't need to. I don't need to actually increase weirdness here. I need to increase some efficacy and some control.
Yeah, that's the really interesting thing I get from the Lovecraftian Kenneth Grant stuff, is that it is really not about control. It's more about like introducing just the, like, a marriage between an other world and this world, you know, and like really blurring the lines of the two, I think psychologically is. And
it's interesting. We did an elder gods working with a group of people of various kind of skill levels when I was in the IoT that I was involved in, but I wasn't at all the lead on. The guy that ran that temple was. And one of the things that came out of that I found really interesting is that I was basically just witnessed the whole thing, even the parts that were really active with me, and I was getting kind of monologue from my allies. And that was the first time that happened in ritual, where they were basically going like, don't worry about the fact that you're not having the experience these people are having, just watch. And it was interesting because I would say half of those people had a pretty good time with that after, and half of them really didn't. Like, and that was kind of for me, that was like there was a lot of, it wasn't like Grant level carnage where it's happening in the real world. But I would say that was not good for the folks that were a little less psychologically stable.
For sure.
At all.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's some of the more interesting parts of Grant's books too, is the lodge stories, you know, some of the just like the violence that's happening in the lodge from these like rituals and stuff, you know, is really chaotic.
It's pretty crazy. Well, it's pretty crazy because I mean, I think you have to read Grant as half fiction.
Of course.
You know, but it's also that distinction between what's happening in someone's inner experience,
exactly,
and what's happening in one's outer experience, and realizing that they are not necessarily the same. But he was useful to me because, like, coming out of my Grant phase where I was kind of done reading him overall, having that kind of in the back of my head during some of these experiences in that IoT group, it was really good for me to go like, okay, so I didn't get this at all, but this person really did. Like, I had enough ability to go, this person isn't making up what they're telling me, but what they're saying they experienced isn't what I saw. So they experienced something different, even though we were 3 feet away from each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this was a huge kind of realization. And it also kind of ties back to something that we talked about earlier, which is kind of that idea of group, egregor, group
Yeah.
culture and folklore.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that a lot of that stuff exists in kind of cultures or in covens or in magical groups very intentionally to produce a similar experience set, because then you can actually, you have people that know what occurred.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you had if you were actually entirely trained within one of those groups, or you actually grew up in a tribal culture, what happens is gonna make sense to the people that could help you.
Yeah.
Modern magic doesn't have a lot of that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. That's interesting.
Yeah. Wow. Awesome conversation.
Yeah, I could keep spinning.
Yeah,
about
we could keep going.
stuff.
Yeah.
I just don't. I don't want to keep you, but
I'm good for about another 20 minutes if you want.
Yeah.
I scheduled you till then. So.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is a really, really interesting part of Grant's work is reifying that new mythology, you know, and sort of almost creating this like half-truth ideology, you know, that he's like putting out there. But
it's interesting, because from Grant, we only really know, or he was only really became well known about Austin Spare, who to me is the much more interesting magician if we're talking about that kind of world, because of Grant's work. But it's also pretty clear that that's synthetic. That the tale of Austin Spare that we get is probably not real, and that I think that was a joint creation. Like Spare knew what Grant wanted to hear. And made up stories. This is my take. And then Grant also embellished the fuck out of those stories once he was gone. Which is a really interesting thing, because you go, again, it's a magical process, right? Now, I have worked with Spare extensively as both as an ancestor and what could be considered a form of necromancy, using, things that have connection to him in a kind of reliquary shrine, and working with him. And he's a potent motherfucker now. And so I believe he was before. But he's really interesting, because again, I thank Kenneth primarily for introducing me to Spare. But so that realization that he was trying to do a particular thing, Grant was. And he was attempting to, and I think he was very successful. If we look at the world now, I don't think that minus the magical work that's been done around all that stuff, it would have become the degree of the pop culture phenomenon that it has.
Right.
I don't think that there would be Elder Gods on Netflix all the time. I don't think we would see that shit to the degree we do if it wasn't for Grant's work.
What do you think of have you seen like the newest Twin Peaks, season?
No, I haven't.
That's it's just Grant all the way down almost. It's really, it's incredible.
I'll have to watch it. I've not heard that, but I loved the first season when it came out. The first ones when it came out. Grant was really good. Was good for me because it made me dig into somebody's writing in a really aggressive way. I was like, there's shit in here that makes sense, and there's shit in here that doesn't. And I wanted to understand kind of his approach, and I didn't get there. I'll send you guys something that I wrote a million years ago that is basically like a little 3-page parody of Grant that I wrote, that I was really stoked to hear that. And that Nima, who knew him, actually sent it to him. She said she read it to him over the phone. And that he was basically falling out of his chair laughing. So I apparently did good.
That's great.
I didn't know that Kenneth really had a sense of humor, but apparently he did.
That's awesome.
But he was really good, because he did make me really dive in. And then I hit this point where I went, this isn't relevant to what I do. And that was the point where I think I really began developing my own work as just a wholesale thing. Like, okay, I'm not bothering with Crowley, I'm not bothering with Grant, I'm not bothering with the Golden Dawn, I'm not bothering with anything that doesn't just grab me. So, you know, probably, you know, Freeze became the primary influence for a long time. And then right before the end of my kind of public adult life, I shut that down for about 10 or 11 years. I had some communication with Andrew Chumbly just a little bit, but I got a hold of the Azuesha, Katub, and God, what else did I get? I want to say there was one other book by him out at that time. Maybe I'm wrong. And came across Nigel Jackson's Call of the Horned Piper and Masks of Misrule. And so those were like all kind of pulled me into this world of British traditional witchcraft, which to me was very influenced by Spare aesthetically.
Yeah.
So those are kind of like lasting influences, probably in part because they were some of the last occult books I ever looked at until about 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
And so it's a very interesting thing. So that's one of the things that I think gets kind of, it totally was, I think that was where the aesthetic that ended up in my jewelry and the aesthetic that ended up in my sigil work in the books and stuff really kind of occurred from being, you know, doing 30 years of sigil work based on Spare, but then specifically the aesthetics that kicked up out of Jackson, probably.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so I have to check those out.
They were, they're probably horribly expensive right now because the company that produced them went out of business, but they're probably available in PDF form. Hopefully Jackson, for a while at least, kind of denounced all of his witchcraft stuff and became involved with kind of the religious traditionalism and Sufism stuff. But he did recently release a new tarot deck, so I'm kind of hoping that he's chilled out a bit about that. And and now that Capelbound's down, we'll get somebody to republish those books because they're quite beautiful.
Yeah, I wrote that down. I have to find a PDF of that. But that's
very interesting stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's a good way to end up too, because getting back to your break from that stuff, it does kind of seem like Kenneth Grant is kind of the end of the line for a certain type of writing. I think the reason why I like it so much is because I really enjoy reading about history stuff, and he's creating this sort of alternate history timeline.
Right.
You know,
absolutely.
It's so enjoyable.
And I think that's a really brilliant move, and I think it's one of the things that gets lost on the academic side here sometimes, is there's something about like so there's interesting stuff. So like if we look at like, we'll use Nigel Jackson in particular, and I know that there's PDFs of some of his stuff floating around, so people could find it if they wanted it. He's kind of taken this really vehemently anti-Christian look at witchcraft that is, to me, really kind of in line with Leland's Aradia, which is my favorite book on witchcraft, and really brings out this kind of like super liminal, super what now gets viewed as kind of hedge writing, really deeply invested in the other world take on witchcraft. That it's not that it didn't exist some before that, but he kind of produced the package that worked. It had the stories, it had the kind of blood and guts edge to it, it had kind of a vehemence to it, and it had no capitulation to acceptability of his thought process, which is, I think, the thing that I love about him and that I see in Grant. And I think that Grant opened this up. This exists in Chumbly definitely too, you know. We're not talking about why you should believe me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We're saying this is what I've experienced and I'm speaking it as truth.
Yep.
And I think that that's really important because we're so far from that world, most of us. And so anything we can kind of get to help us in to kind of break off these kind of shackles of materialism and kind of dualist religion and all that stuff are very helpful. And so that immersive aspect, I think that I got a lot of benefit out of, even urban fantasy like Charles DeLint, even as a practitioner, not having those experiences be the same at all. it was still
Yeah.
beneficial because this begins to counter a lot of story. You get to spend a couple hours not
Right.
in the dominant paradigm. You get to shift
Right.
into a different
Yeah.
explanation of how the world works.
Yep.
Yeah, I found sci-fi and fantasy, more fantasy, as a really helpful way to think about how you might start to move away from the everyday. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a useful thing, and so I think that it's again. I think that's where one of the another thing that I get a lot is I got a letter just a couple of days ago from somebody going like, I think they were listening to the Glitch Bottle podcast, and they were like, "This was such a relief to have somebody be completely unapologetically a freak about this shit. Like, you didn't like really defer to any of the academia or any of that stuff." And they're just comfortable saying like, yeah, crazy ass shit happens. It really does. Yes, it's happening internally for the most part, but it produces effects in the real world. And yeah, it's like, and I've seen a lot of physical stuff. I've seen a lot of people who can throw shit around with their minds.
Mm-hmm.
I knew two guys that could like pick a particular book off the shelf and drop it on the ground. Now they couldn't fly it to their desk or something, but they were able to do that shit. And I saw that shit when I was 100% there and on multiple occasions, you know.
Yeah.
And I've seen people make people fall down. That's another. I've definitely seen that.
Yeah.
So you go, we have more power than we think we have, and to me, that's the base interest in magic. Is this acquisition of levels of power that the cultures we're in would prefer we did not think we had.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. For sure.
I think that's a great place to
it's an awesome
let you go to. But wow, that was an amazing interview, and we appreciate you coming on and speaking with us so much.
No, thank you for having me. It's a total pleasure.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So what led you guys into all this stuff? I'll turn the table for a second if you don't mind.
Yeah. Man, it's funny. I don't know. Probably goofy stuff on History Channel, I think. Like,
right on.
You know, like I think probably the first, but I mean, you know, weird experiences too, of course. But I think the first kind of thing I picked up was probably Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And I love the sort of like historical mystery, you know, is really what drew me in. But then from there, you know, you get into Crowley and all that stuff, and it just builds and builds and builds, and there's always another take on it, you know, in another direction, and that's where we're at. But the practicality stuff is becoming really interesting, and as you get older, you know, like inciting positive change in your life through these rituals is super important. So
I got into this sort of thing sort of three-prongedly. It's very connected to my writing and poetry practice. That's very much working with, I'm not actually sure who it is, so it's kind of some strange sort of visionary and like weird experiences connected to some health stuff when I was a kid, sort of put me into, I don't know, I'm not sure, a lot of it's just kind of unknown, but and the thing that kind of brought me into it, like when I was older, like a middle teenager, was like UFOs, and thinking of, kind of not knowing it, but thinking of magic through the lens of like ufology, and that kind of inevitably leads you back to, you know, the much older and more ingrained magic tradition, I think, if you're, you know, if you really follow it. I mean, you can obviously just think there's like, you know, literal aliens, but you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I think, you know, for me, it was a mix too. It's like I said, you know, I had experiences that I perceived as Men in Black experiences, things like that. There wasn't any linkage between the two. I think maybe, but again, then when I brought that up to that witch, her mom had multiple Men in Black experiences through the years.
Yeah.
And so that was also one of those things where like, okay, I'm not sure I had the same experience she did.
Right.
But you have someone validating who, weird as fuck, but was entirely sane as far as I was concerned, you know.
Yeah.
Wow. Next time we have you on, we're gonna have to delve deep into the significance of the Men in Black archetype.
It's super weird. Super weird. Yeah, it's definitely not a specialty of mine, but I did have that one experience, and it was like, that was freaky.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the way that ties in with like sleep paralysis visions and the archetype. My mom, who is the most what's the word, materialist person I know, just like has no interest in any of this, but who I feel like also has some kind of like I don't know, some she'll like say something will happen, then it'll happen, like that kind of thing. But she doesn't believe in any of it. Anyway, she like had this first sleep paralysis, and she was like, I saw this guy standing in the corner with a hat and
man.
she had no, and like that's just like, but people see that and no one like like.
Oh yeah, no, it's super interesting.
Like
Well,
what? Yeah,
Well, I think that's one of the things here that to me is the big thing about magic is, and it's why I have, I'll give great credit to academia and great credit to tradition, but they are the two biggest things that keep people from accepting their own experiences as real.
right.
And so I tend to, I'll be polite about them, but never give them a whole lot of credence just in public, because it's like, it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
Right.
What you think someone experienced and what they told you they experienced is not the same as having that as a consistent thing go on for a long period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's a point where it changes and you go, okay, the world is not how I think it is.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah. Whether or not you like lean into it, I guess, or if you are sort of hounded by it, it's kind of like, I don't know which is better, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it was a great pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much again.
To our listeners, do check out Weaving Fate, which is the most recent book, Weaving Fate, Hypersigils, Changing the Past, and Telling True Lies. Also, 6 Ways is fairly recent as well.
About 2 years old, 2.5 years.
Yeah, and these books can be found at...
Generally online. There are some brick and mortar stores that carry them, but generally you'll be able to find them online.
Any preference as to where to direct people?
Doesn't affect us.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay,
Cool.
great.
So grab them where you can. Yeah.
Yeah, get these books. Really important stuff.
Yeah. Awesome.
And thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure. Great way to spend a Sunday for me and Ben.
Totally.
All right. Thank you.
You'll do well.